Good morning and welcome to our live webinar on LGBTQ plus rights in Islamic law, the case of Malaysia. This event is hosted by the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy at the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs of Florida International University. It is also made possible by our co-sponsor, the FIU Center for Women's and Gender Studies, whom we thank for their support and participation. My name is Sophie Lemiere, and I am the Senior Program Coordinator at the Havel Program, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's session. With a recent landmark court win for a 30-year-old Malaysian man against an Islamic court ban on quote-unquote unnatural sex, LGBTQ plus advocates raised hopes for a greater acceptance of gay rights in a Muslim-majority country. Yet, the influence of conservative Islam in Malaysia is evident in various aspects of society and culture, where gay and non-gender conforming individuals are victims of discrimination and violence. Today, we will have the pleasure of listening to what is sure to be a fascinating conversation between two experts, Dr. Sophie Lemiere and Dr. Jessy Abouarab, who will discuss the social construction, regulation, and governance of sex, gender, and sexuality in the case of Malaysia. Dr. Lemiere is a political anthropologist whose research focuses on religion, politics, and criminality in a comparative perspective, and she is currently studying Malaysian politics. In fact, she joins us now from Kuala Lumpur. She is also a research associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and a senior fellow at our Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. Dr. Abouarab is a visiting assistant professor at the FIU Center for Women's and Gender Studies. She holds a PhD in international relations, majoring in foreign policy and security studies in the Middle East, and specializing in women's and gender studies. This one-on-one conversation between two experts will shed light over issues surrounding international LGBTQ plus rights, Malaysian politics, and the complex dynamics within the Malaysian dual legal system, where civil and Islamic courts coexist. Questions about LGBTQ plus rights and heteronationality will be raised, expanding on notions of cultural relativism about sexual orientation and its relation to anti-gender policies and rape culture. So I'd like to welcome you both. Thank you for joining us. And I am now pleased to introduce Dr. Abouarab. We'll start the conversation.
Thank you for the introduction, Ophelia, and thank you, Sophie, for making this happen. Again, can you see the map on the screen? Is that good? Okay. Well, as we know, throughout the space and time, sexual relationship have always existed on a continuum, right? That shows diversity of behavior, where each society, depending on how it grows, interprets different sexual activities, perception regarding sexuality in different ways. So as social animals, individuals are socialized into different attitudes, behavior, depending on their nuclear families, education system, peers, media, and religion. Historically, religion has been one of the greatest influence, depending on where you live. So when we talk about Malaysia, as you see, it's a rich country that has been there for a long period, playing a big role between countries within East Asia. And this vital role of trade carried the meaning within the local identities regarding the wasatiyah, right? Concept of wasatiyah, which foster harmony, diversity. We have three major groups, ethnic groups within Malaysia today, where you have cohabitation between Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists from that region and whatnot. So you have a concept of akhlaq, which are like basically based on manners, right? It's not just about acceptance, but more about this multiculturalism, this open house that they always been known for, right? So, but as we've seen from this title and this topic that we're going to talk about, things have been shifting where sexuality have been, a big issue there, where orientation and identity has been called into the public and especially political sphere. And I wanted to open it for Sophie to tell us, as a political anthropologist and a Malaysian specialist, if you can provide us a quick overview of this evolution of this heteronormative state of Malaysia that we're witnessing today.
Sure. Good evening, everybody. It's evening here in Kuala Lumpur. So first, I wanted to thank everybody who took part in organizing this seminar today, Ophelia, Pedro, David, and of course, Jessy. It's a great opportunity to touch on a topic that is too rarely addressed when it comes to Malaysian politics. I just want to thank as well, I don't know if they're online, but I really want to thank my two colleagues, Vilashini Somia from University Malaya and Colin Jeroms from UniMass, for sharing their experience and knowledge, because they are the two real gender studies experts, as I am coming from a political science, political anthropology perspective. So Jessy, well, has already mentioned a few things about Malaysia and the extraordinary ethnic, historical, and religious heritage of the country. And I think there's just a few things that we need to remember for the sake of this discussion tonight. So Malaysia is independent since 1957. It's a majority Muslim country, and the majority of the inhabitants of Malaysia are called Malays, and they are met with Chinese, a very large Chinese population as well, Indian population and indigenous population, and together they form the Malaysian nation. We have about 60% of people who are practicing the Islamic faith. And then we have Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, minorities, and a lot of different as well Chinese religions that are being practiced. The very interesting thing about Malaysia, especially when you're a political scientist or a legalist, is that Malaysia is ruled by a dual legal system. So we have the civil courts and we have the Islamic court. So the law is entrenched in the constitution, the federal constitution. But the federal constitution that was drafted in 1956 on the way to independence leave some space for the Islamic courts to be able to function. The Islamic courts are actually dealing with matter related to family law and anything that has to do with pertaining to Islam and religion in general. So Islamic courts are only for Muslim people, but the decisions of Islamic court, of course, may sometimes have influence on non-Muslim in terms of marriage, divorce, child custody, etc. So I think that for the sake of this discussion, we really need to understand that in Malaysia, there is a real complexity due to the overlap of religion and ethnicity, because both have become a marker of identity. And this identity is fixed by the state. So I'll give you an example. A Malay in the constitution is defined as someone who professes Islam, someone who practices adat, which is the Malay custom, and someone who speaks Malay. And as well, there are some provision related to the place of birth. So other individuals are not defined in the constitution, but we already have the majority of the country defined by the state, by the constitution legally, which means that it is not possible to get out of this category, which leads to extremely difficult legal imbroglio when a Malay person wants, for example, to renounce Islam. We're not going to dwell into this discussion tonight, but it's just for you to understand how the state categories in Malaysia are completely fixed and completely sclerosed. So the question of homosexuality that we're going to talk about tonight, and the question of non-heterosexual behavior and identities in general, do represent a challenge to traditional masculinity as it is defined in all patriarchal societies, and sometimes as well, of course, crystallized in the religious traditions. So it's not unique to Malaysia, but it's a global phenomenon, and we have seen, some symptoms of it all over the world. So the term deviance, as it is being used in Malaysia, is politically relevant only in societies like Malaysia, where sexual identity and behaviors are perceived as a state matter and regulated and policed by the state. So it means that any attack on morality only carry meanings in a context where morality is defined in precise objective terms. So legally, institutionally, religiously, etc., and perceived as well as a condition to the legitimacy of people, to identity of people, etc. So to put it very simply, the idea of deviance only exists in places where morality is normative. Normality is defined legally. So the norms, since we're talking about the question of laws and legality here, we have to remember that really the pillar and the structure of a system and allow this system to maintain itself. So the existence of plural sexual identities or sexual identities that do not fit the norm as defined by the state, they represent a challenge to the kind of collective image or collective imaginary and culture. So it raises three main questions. So the inclusion of all minorities in contrast to dominant narrative that actually exclude them. It raised the question of the anti-Western narrative, according which homosexuality and all form of deviance is coming from the West. This is what we hear here in Malaysia and in other countries. And finally, it was the question of the heteronormative and patriarchal structure of society. So the last point I will make here is that if any identities, and especially the one that we're talking about tonight, do not match the dominant categories that are framed by this patriarchal, heterosexual, ethnic, religious, conservative discourse, they're like floating in the air. They're just not there, they're not there, they don't belong there, they don't belong there, they're definitely on the margin. So those floating identities are kind of forgotten citizens that have no choice but to hide or to lie about who they are and their identities, and they're totally marginalized, if not criminalized. And their presence outside the norm is actually a push for change as well. So then it means that we need to create new norms, but this is the main difficulty in this context.
100%. And like you said, I really appreciate you showing how the concept of akhlaq, manners, within the Muslim community there changed due to, you know, the British colonial presence there, where the terminology homosexuality does not exist in the in the Quran. But the concept of lut, the word lut, how it changed, unnatural sex, that exists in both the dual legal system, have been interpreted to target, right, queer minorities within the population. And of course, when it comes to gender, right, with the people that are transgender, how the concept of transgender and concept of queer sexuality have been considered as these foreign imports from the West, and that does not exist within our community, right? And the concept of akhlaq, which was based on, you know, communal respect, inclusivity, multiculturalism, have been shifting towards more, like you said, but controlling bodies and politicization of sexuality due to political benefits and whatnot. So on that note, when it comes to Islamic laws, right, that are not, as we see, they are a state matter in Malaysia. And when you talk about the religion, right, people trying to switch to Christianity, whatnot, there's a issue there. So what is the current state of LGBTQ right now within these laws in Malaysia? And how does gender and sexuality intersect with that concept?
So basically, as I mentioned earlier, we have a dual legal system in Malaysia. So actually here, I'll just comment a minute on the slide that that Jessy is showing right now. It gives you a very interesting idea about the perception of society towards transgender people in particular. I think it is on this slide. It's a very interesting report that was published by UCLA. So I really encourage you to find it on Google. It's very easy. And you see the confusion and the kind of perception that exists of and against transgender people regarding, so some of the question asked to people is whether they do consider that transgender people do have a kind of handicap or a mental illness, and I'll let you discover the answers, and it's actually pretty disturbing. The more, I think, disturbing thing that you would be discovering in this report that you might not see on this slide immediately is that the segment of society that is actually the most conservative is the young generation. And this is something that is extremely interesting to see in this country. So let's come back just for a moment on the legal issue, right? So as we mentioned earlier, we have this dual legal system. So we need to keep in mind that in this country, we have two sets of laws that are actually condoning non-heterosexual behaviors. We're not only talking about sexual intercourse, but we're talking as well about demonstration of one's sexual identity. And so both the penal code and the Islamic law, the Sharia code, are condemning this. So I'll start with the civil law, right? So the penal code does not specifically refer to homosexuality per se, but refers to, quote, carnal intercourse against the order of nature. We're here talking about civil law. I'm not talking yet about religious law. So this interpretation, it includes sex between men and between women, and is punishable with a term of imprisonment up to 20 years, and also punished with whipping. So we have actually quite a few set of articles. We always refer to Article 337A of the Penal Code that actually gives a definition to what is carnal intercourse against the order of nature, which is introduction of the penis into the anus or mouth of the other person. That is what is carnal intercourse against the order of nature about. So this is liable, as said, to up to 20 years of prison and whipping. The section C of this article, and it's something that I really want to stress on tonight, is only introduced the notion of non-consent, which means that rape involving a same-sex individual is included in this set of provision related to sex against nature, rather than being included in other section of the penal code related to sexual violence. And I think that this is something that is extremely disturbing, I would say the least. So then we go into Islamic law. So laws relating to LGBTQ issues are frequently an Islamic law offense. As I said, it applies to Muslim in the entire country. Though Islamic law in Malaysia is not harmonized, and in the 13 different states, we may have differences into the sentence that may be given for such act. But anyway, throughout the country, in all of the states, same-sex sexual acts are criminalized with fines or up to 3 years imprisonment and whipping, which means that Islamic law actually only would condemn people of 3 years imprisonment, while the civil law would give up to 20 years. So the recent decision that Ophelia mentioned in her introduction in February, the federal court, so the civil court, declared that the Sharia enactment of the state of Selangor, which is actually one of the states very close to the capital, Kuala Lumpur, so this provision related to sexual intercourse against nature was declared unconstitutional, not for the reason that it's seen as discriminatory or any form of violence, but only because it already belongs to civil law. So basically what the court said is that there's an overlapping in laws, and the federal constitution supersede Islamic law. So Islamic law should not be redundant, basically. So this decision creates a precedent that could theoretically be followed by other legal challenge of similar provision in other states. More importantly, we may hope that this could open a legal discussion on the controversial Article 377 that I described earlier. But what we need to remember, and it's the last point that I will give on this question in particular, is that these laws have been mostly used in this country to discredit or to silence political opponents and to discriminate against non-heterosexual and non-binary individuals. So at sometimes we can see that the judiciary may anticipate on socio-political debates, and this is what's happening right now. This decision has kind of opened a discussion that is a very painful one in Malaysia. But it is merely a legal case, but it kind of casts the spotlight on the issue of sexuality in Malaysia society at large that we will discuss again further later in this discussion. So the question of sexual identity and behaviors, and more specifically, heteronormativity, can no longer be ignored in the country. And of course, it raised the issue of minorities more in general and plurality as a construction, as a challenge to national identity and dominant narrative.
Definitely, and again, like you stated, it doesn't not stop on sexual acts, but it transgressed to body politics, right? Even like how you behave, what you dress, how you should act, and whatnot. And this is what like I like to connect it with basically the discourse, right? The narratives that create knowledge, and the people that are in power religiously or politically, the way they formulate and how that concept of loot, right, which comes from the Bible, Quran, all that stuff, how that term moved and changed and whatnot to encompass sexual behavior that is considered unnatural, and also transgress to how even heterosexual people, it doesn't matter, it touches with gender identity, gender performance, how you see yourself and how you dress up and how you even cut your hair, Sophie, that basically gets control. And we're gonna get into that. So again, I wanted to push it further, if it's okay with you, where this concept, the continuum of Malaysia becoming industrialized, out there, open market economy, and debunk the theories that you cannot have this country or state evolving economically, being open, connecting capitalism, whatnot, with human rights, right? So when it comes to industrialized open market economy, Malaysia is awfully advanced, right? It's a big trade hub connecting the Indian Ocean with South China Sea and all that stuff. So how does it play when it comes to LGBT rights, connecting with economy and freedom of expression, and what strategies have been used to change this conversation within
Yeah, well, it's always a very tricky question, because we've seen, the debate, the discussion that were held when Trump was president of the United States, related the discussion related to transgender rights and LGBTQI rights in general as well. And we could see that, part of the American opinion was actually very conservative regarding these issues. So talking about conservatism, we observe in Malaysia, and again, I'm sending you back to this amazing UCLA study that was done. We observed that Malaysian societies in general remain quite conservative, and that's why I was explaining you earlier that the young generation is actually very conservative as well. So we see very strong position regarding death penalty, regarding sexual rights, etc. So of course, economic liberalism does not mean that a society is liberal, and especially regarding sexual behavior and sexual identity. We are looking at a conservative society, but that kind of transcends, and it's one thing that unites people basically, and sadly, the question of sexual rights and sexual identity transcend ethnic and religious borders, meaning that in general, Malaysian society is quite conservative. And we're not only talking about the Muslim section of society. So very interestingly, we have had in 2018 a very important change of government that was interpreted outside of Malaysia and in Malaysia as well, of course, as a big turn, a big democratic turn. So we have seen the end of 61 years of a single party rule, single party monopoly. And this was seen as maybe a chance for greater rights, more freedom, a deeper respect for human rights, etc. But very interestingly, it is exactly during those years that we have seen an increase of the number of violence against minorities and against LGBTQ plus groups in particular. And so I have a few examples here. So for example, the election were held in 2018. And we had the Blue Boy nightclub that has been operating in Malaysia for decades. We have seen arrest and detention of some of its clients or members who were then forced to rehabilitation center. And I'll talk about that just after. We've seen in the same year, 2 women who were arrested in the state of Terengganu. It's one of the northern state in Malaysia. Muslim, rather with a Muslim conservative majority. Those 2 women were arrested as they were on the verge of committing lesbian sex. So I don't know what that means, but anyway, they were found in their car, completely dressed, and the police said that they were about to engage in sex against nature. And so those 2 women were sentenced to whipping under Islamic law, and the prime minister at the time, who actually lost power 22 months later, who is not known for being the most liberal individual, Mahathir Mohamad, qualified that the canning of those 2 women as cruel. And he totally disagreed with the judgment that was made, but unfortunately, for political reason, there is no further action were taken to change the law. So in 2018, we have seen a push for rehabilitation of people perceived as deviant, and state and federal authorities have promoted rehabilitation or re-education center that aim at changing one's sexual orientation or gender identity. And so the government also published an ebook that intended to steer LGBTQ persons to the right path. And it has been reported that individuals were encouraged to attend re-education center, especially those people who were seeking treatment for HIV. So as they were seeking their treatment, they would be, oriented as well to go in a center to become straight again. So-called again. So actually you can see here on the slide that Jessy is showing us that we have seen in the newspaper this publication of a list about how to spot a gay person, and at some point one of the parents union or parents association as well did publish a leaflet that give a few advice to parents to be able to spot, whether they're, or to try to see whether the kids were, going on the wrong path. And in the long list of things that they should look for was, if their son was wearing a V-neck t-shirt or wearing a tote bag, that would be definitely a sign that he was going the wrong way, quote unquote. So in 2018, the same year, the Federal Islamic Development Department and the Islamic Affairs Department, basically, which in Malaysia are a very strong institution, declared that they happily returned 3,000 people to the heterosexual norm. Unfortunately, we don't have, of course, real figure over this, and we have seen over the past 2 years and now 3 years since 2018 that the situation did not improve much for LGBTQ plus people.
Yeah, exactly. And what you see here, basically, this reinvention, right, of the concept of masculinity. that was kind of reinvented, as I call, due to the adoption of this colonial rule, adoption of local, culture, and how that turned into this dangerous concept of what is said toxic masculinity. That if somebody does not look masculine enough, right, they create these mechanisms, systemic tools where teachers, family members, anybody is encouraged to call them out, right? So the concept of calling out in order to help them, right, be cured from whatever deviances that they had. So for you to see that the concept of this Western relate like basically this Western attitude towards um, queer population, that even in the West change, that get adapted and get stuck within this region, where the patriarchal society now is shifting from hospitality, multiculturalism, whatnot, to concept of toxic masculinity and calling people out. So on that note, I wanted to see that, okay, so all these happening, but what's happening on the ground? So when it comes to queer population, when it comes to human mobility, the relationship between identity and sexuality, and how we can have resilience, right? What are the resilience strategies the LGBTQ community have in Malaysia? Is it just fight or flight? Do they just leave? What happened?
So, so there is a few things happening at the moment that are quite interesting, and we can see that in many societies. Actually, it's not just in Malaysia, but I see it in my country, in France as well. There are suffering from different communities that are victim of discrimination and violence. We have had massive cases in France about rape or systemic rape culture at school, about feminicide, about incest. So all those discussions are emerging in every society, which is a very interesting phenomenon. So Malaysia, of course, is not impermeable to that, and there are some discussion, very difficult one that need to be held, of course, and we can feel that there are very strong push. So of course, it's not just being a victim, but as you said, it's what's the resilience, what is being done, and what we can do on the ground. So we've seen more recently a case, and I think you have a slide about it, Jessy. This girl who exposed one of her teacher for him having made a rape joke at school. And so she made a little video on TikTok that was seen multiple times throughout the world. And where she explains what happened at school, and she explains, I mean, you can see, the tone and how she's, of course, you can see the despair, in the voice of this girl, and she's only 17. And so we've seen the reaction, the very violent backlash that she has been victim of from the teachers' union, from the teacher in her school, from other students who threatened her further. She received a letter, and she's been threatened to be expelled from school. The head of the teachers' union in Malaysia said that there is no such thing as systemic rape culture. So it's a very difficult conversation, and it seems that while some people are definitely pushing for this, which is a very good and healthy sign, I think, there is a very strong pushback from the state, from state institution against even raising the problem. So of course, in this context, the protection from authorities, it's just impossible. So when we're talking about violence against transgender people, which and we have to remember that transgender are in general more at risk among the LGBT community to be victim of physical violence or arrest in Malaysia, because they are more visible than other individuals who might not being exposed that much. So protection from authorities is just impossible. So then the choice that people are left with is relocation. So the internal relocation in Malaysia is one option. And so when people live in states that are less tolerant of different type of identities, then they can always, come closer to Kuala Lumpur, or, or the state of Selangor, or the capital of Kuala Lumpur, or any urban area. That is one viable option. But then, of course, in other cases, asylum may be granted in other countries in certain cases. And I was reading about that this afternoon, actually, what were the policies of the UK regarding giving asylum to Malaysians who may be at risk for their safety. So we have one very strong example case that just happened just earlier this year. Noor Sajjad is an entrepreneur, and she's an influencer. So she's a transgender female, and she has basically, she's on the run. And the police has declared just a few months back that there was more than 180 men, and I say men on the ground from the religious authorities and the police force looking for her. So in the context, so we have to remember that we are in the context of a pandemic, where all the frontline workers are just exhausted, where the police needs to do roadblocks constantly to make sure that the lockdown is being respected by people, and yet they still find 180 men to go on the ground to look for this woman who has committed no other crime but being who she is. And this really show like kind of this kind of backlash that I was explaining about person who would not confer to the categories as defined by the state, or any person like Ain who would actually challenge this kind of status quo of systemic discrimination towards any population that is perceived as being in minority or in a vulnerable position, whether we're talking about women, transgender people, gay individuals, foreign workers. And it's something that I really want to stress, is that one discrimination leads to another one. So we are in a state where, as I explained earlier, we have a defined category for Malay people. So any Malay person who decided that, well, this category just does not suit them, and they feel and they want to be who they are, but it doesn't fit the constitution. So any person who is not does not obey those very strict categories, or does not obey the order of society, patriarchal heteronormative order of society, is being seen as a threat. So someone who would call a teacher for a rape joke and challenge a patriarchal system is being threatened. Someone who is a transgender is being threatened, and anyone and any other person that may just challenge, again, the status quo.
Yeah, and again, like you said, different grassroots have different maneuver, and if it's out there, unfortunately, it's seen as a disruption, as a deviant to the status quo. And as you stated, there have been some pushbacks regarding the famous case where a man challenged the court, where transgender people also. There's another case where transgender people also challenge the court. Some of them win, some of them lose. It's a progress, and it's constant, and women have been on the forefront, like you said, when it comes to controlling people's bodies. Of course, women are going to be affected mostly, and transgender people as well. So this process of coming out becomes that unviable, because they're communal. So it's more of letting in that it happens underground, like you stated. But so again, I really appreciate your input on that. Is there anything you'd like to add regarding, how to combat discrimination, either legally, conduct campaigns? Is there any kind of on the ground? I hear that there's election coming up, and things are shifting. Do you see anything there happening?
Well, we could have election by the end of the year, but we are in a very complex political context right now because we're in a state of emergency, which means that political activities are completely blocked. The parliament is closed for health reason because of the pandemic, but of course we all know that the state of emergency was called mostly for political reasons. So we could have an election being held by the end of the year, but in no way those questions of sexual identities or gender-based violence or discrimination are questions that are being raised by politicians. And so we have seen again in 2018 when the world who knows Malaysia, so part of the world was looking at Malaysia with big eyes, thinking that, well, that's it, we're tagging this incredible democratic turn. We all got very disappointed when a very disturbing case of child marriage was exposed. A young girl of 7 years old was promised to an older man, and she was married, I think, when she was 10 to this 41 years old man. And the Minister of Women Affairs at the time was no other than the Deputy Prime Minister as well, a woman, declared that she could not do anything because the marriage had been celebrated Islamically and it was in conformity with Islamic law. So of course, very big part of society pushed against it. There was a consensus about the fact that this was child grooming and that this could not be made possible. So we're slowly moving towards a more acceptable kind of norm regarding child marriage, but it's not yet enacted in every state. So they are progress, but very slow one. And again, it's something that is perceived by politicians are politically very risky. So they would rather just silence it, leave it on the side. And we haven't seen many people taking a stand for Ain, unfortunately. The Ministry of Education made only one declaration, one statement, same with the Ministry of Women. And since then, we haven't seen anything happening. So it's quite frustrating, I would say, for people on the ground. That's for sure. Maybe there are some questions. We have still like 10 minutes. So if there is any question, I'll be happy to answer, or we can keep going. I mean, I can talk about Malaysia for 3 more days. So.
It's a whole field but yes, please, I would love to open it for the participants. If you can write down in the chat or raise your hand, we can add you to the conversation. We would appreciate that. So until we hear about that, like maybe a question or two, again, when we talk about alliances, right, this international community that is pushing for human rights, this cultural relativist push from the end of the government, again, either for political reasons, given that 60% of the population, the majority are considered Muslims, and also the role of Islamic laws within there. How are they, the fiqh, interpreting these and hashing it out? So do you see any connection between like local grassroots happening with international community on the ground regarding defending the human rights of their minorities?
Yeah, they are. I mean, it's like, Malaysian society is extremely connected. So the struggle on the ground of all minority groups is always linked or bridged to the struggle of the same group of people in other countries. So, of course, there are a lot of, again, bridges and because as well of the history of this country, there's a very strong relationship with groups in the UK as well that are fighting for the same rights. So we're definitely, the struggle of Malaysians from minority groups is really something completely universal, of course, and very international as well. There is some international pressure on the Malaysian government. But the Malaysian governments, for all the Malaysian governments actually, have really always used cultural relativism in order to push away human rights. So for I was mentioning earlier Mohamed Mahathir, who was the prime minister from 2018 until 2020. And he was actually before that prime minister for no less than 22 years. So he kind of left a mark on this country. So he was prime minister from 1981 until 2002, 2003. During those 22 years, the concept of human rights was a concept that he always pushed back by defining it as a Western concept, Western values, and instead promoting Asian values. So that would actually as well include some of the Muslim Islamic heritage of the country. This discourse has completely changed in 2018 when he came back to power. Because of the political jump he made, he kind of like adopted a more universal, democratic, inclusive, pro-human right discourse, because this was serving his new narrative against the prime minister that was in power at that time. Despite adopting this new discourse, this new human rights discourse, we have not seen much change on the ground. So we were really hoping again that this kind of new positioning of the government would translate into effective policies. So some would of course say that the government did not have time to make changes, but what I strongly believe is that there was not a strong will to make changes on the ground. And I think child marriage is one of the main examples. They did not push it far enough because they were afraid of offending part of their bases, despite the fact that child marriage is actually one of the less controversial issues, because it is where people would, it's a question on which a large number of people would agree.
Yes, and on that note, there was one question by Omar Lutfi, where they asked the question, I think you answered it, pertaining to child marriage. Is it connected with poverty? Whereas like when you look at the most cases, especially like with the Syrian refugee crisis, where you have some cases, parents, right, marrying their children as a means to provide them economic prosperity and in order to survive. Does that apply in the case?
Yeah. So the case that I was mentioning earlier about this little girl, she was in fact from a considered poor family, and she was married, if I'm not mistaken, to a rubber tapper, which is definitely not the highest income individual that you may find in the country. So it was, the family said that basically they wanted to have someone who could provide for her. And she was the daughter of migrants from, or maybe refugee from southern Thailand. So of course we are seeing those child marriage cases in family among population that are less economically favored and less educated as well.
Yeah, and also we have knowledge about how women are highly educated, right, compared to men within the population. And on that, when you mentioned Thailand, what are the implications of this development in Malaysia, beyond Malaysia, to its neighboring country, especially Thailand, known for Bangkok, the haven for queer people, population, and whatnot. So the Malaysia set a precedent elsewhere? Is it impacting? What are the implications of these changes within the neighboring countries?
Yeah, well, I think that, of course, Thailand is seen as being much more tolerant in general when it comes to gender identities, but as well when it comes to recreation in general, with some extreme as well that are very regrettable. But so it offers kind of a haven as well for people, who live in Malaysia to go and get a break in Bangkok or in Bali as well. Bali is one places, but recently it became a controversy as well because an American woman who was in Bali, posted, I think, on Twitter a little story, or maybe Instagram, saying that Bali was basically a hub for LGBTQ community, and and so she was kicked out of the state. So that was not the best thing to do for her. But they are, neighboring countries do have a higher tolerance or different laws, and so that can as well represent a kind of a safer space to some extent for Malaysians.
Yeah, but in the case of Malaysia, like impacting, let's say, the status quo within Singapore and these other countries within, do you see it like carrying a precedent somewhere else? These, conservative.
Yeah. So basically, I think that Malaysia has not yet taken any direction that is so revolutionary that it would impact other country. So I think actually the decision that was very interesting is when Taiwan allowed same-sex marriage. That created a precedent in the region, and that raised some debates. Of course, most Malaysians just pushed it back. And again, I send you back to this UCLA report where there is mention about same-sex marriage. So Malaysians in general are not quite ready for this, and definitely no politician would ever defend that for the moment. But it is something that raised, kind of some question in the region, and that's very interesting. And talking about politician, I would add that it is something we have to remember that even if homosexuality per se, or it is criminalized in the country, it is known. It is known that people in the government or people who occupies political position are homosexual, and so there is tolerance towards them, but they do have to keep some form of normality, meaning that a lot of them would be married and then have a boyfriend or a girlfriend on the side, and it's something that is known. So there is kind of a level of tolerance and double standard, of course, if you're a politician.
Yeah, so here, like, you see the level of intersectionality, right?
Exactly.
Like, privileging certain people over others depending on how
exactly
they fit in, right, within the society. And
exactly
here where, like, there's some points were raised really interesting, which is surprising. Like you stated, the youth is becoming more conservative in Malaysia, which is basically I don't know, do you see it affecting how community organizing action, like you stated, in around LGBTQ in Malaysia, do you not see it thriving within this coming year? Why not? Because of that, like the youth being conservative in Malaysia?
I think that there is, while you have a segment of the youth that are becoming more conservative, I think it's a reaction to another segment of the youth that is becoming more liberal. So I think it's like there is kind of a gap that is being created between communities, because there is a stronger push for more liberal society and more accepting society. So of course, the kind of the other side of the coin is that you have the emergence as well of kind of a stronger conservative groups as well. So I think it kind of goes together. So I would not see it in a negative way. I would just say that this is a backlash that you would see in any kind of struggle for greater rights in any society. So I would even say that it's positive. It means that there is a push somewhere, and it's kind of a it's kind of a reaction, a very strong epidermic reaction, to this push for more rights.
Definitely, because that topic is not anymore invisible, right? So
exactly, yeah.
So that's great. And regarding to, you mentioned there's female members within the legislative, judiciary body. How are these women, practicing their political position roles in creating change? Do you see them more of the conservative push, religious conservatism, or you see them more helping the people, especially from their group and minorities within that push?
So unfortunately, the women who so far have been in charge in this country or in the government are not the ones who really defended minorities as much as we would have expected. As I mentioned, the former Minister of Women Affairs was not able to deal properly with the issue of child marriage, and she took very timid position regarding child marriage. And we have kind of a few individuals who are talking about women's rights, but this is the most extreme that they would go. And definitely no mention is ever made of LGBTQ plus community. It is something that is seen as too costly politically.
So on that note, do you see that like the way forward for LGBTQ rights is it separation of religious and the cultural ideologies, basically separating politics from religion as it happened here in the West? Or do you think that, it could coexist and shift into something together?
Well, I think that it did not happen in the West. The separation between religion and politics, it might have not happened in America, that's for sure. But I'm French, so it's something that I'll be very clear on. And we see as well the vestige of religious culture in my own country when it comes to Islamophobia. So I think that, in any religious society or any society even that describe itself as a secular society, but with a strong religious background or inheritance, I think there is still rooms for understanding and for openness. And I think I don't see religion as being the extreme opposition to different kind of sexual identities or behavior. And as you mentioned earlier, I mean, we have in Islam this, amazing tool, fiqh. And so Islam is a religion that is deemed to evolve and is supposed to be discussed. And there is always this very strong tradition of discussion, of looking again at the law, of reinterpretation, etc. And it's something extremely important. Unfortunately, it was lost on the way, and is definitely not being practiced in Malaysia as it should be, and as it is being practiced in other countries. So I think there is no need to push religion away in order to leave some space for people of different identity. I think that, everything can definitely, I think that religion could even be a tool to allow a more inclusion of different kind of identity in society.
Definitely, and this is where we need to challenge the notion that Islam, religion is inherently homophobic and divided and separated from the West. Then culture, it's mostly basically fluid.
Yeah,
it varies across space and time.
And we have seen, and I'm sorry on that note, we have seen, for example, the Mormon Church in the US that has been going through extremely painful internal debate regarding the place of women in the church, regarding the place of Black people in the church as well, and of homosexuality. The Christian Catholic Church is going through this kind of debate as well. So I think it is something where there is room, and there's some will as well to have those debates. I think we're not quite ready in Malaysia, but hopefully soon.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Sophie. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
I hope we answered them. And on that note, have a wonderful evening. Here it's daytime.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. Thanks again for this opportunity, and have a very good evening, everybody, or day.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.